And that's us live. So, hi Sean, how you doing?
I'm good, thank you, Vic.
Excellent, excellent. Well, welcome everyone to the next in our Vic and Sean series. So we've had quite a few now, Sean. We did the ones before Christmas.
Yeah.
And we've done a few since. We've kind of got into kind of doing one a month, haven't we?
Yeah, we have.
We've done this one a little bit early because you suggested you wanted to maybe chat around about communion around about Easter time. So this one's a little bit early.
Yeah.
Probably. I think we had the last one about 16th or 17th, wasn't it, in March?
Yeah, I think this is just 2 weeks later than the last one.
But that's fine. So, you suggested we should have a chat about communion. Communion's really important in our church, Murray Grace Fellowship, where we take communion every time we meet. We also do communion every time we're online. So at the start of lockdown, we were having communion every day, and now we're down to, 4 times a week?
4 times a week, 3 or 4. Yeah, 4 times a week, because you do it on Sundays as well.
Yeah, so we've been having it on Monday night, and Sean's been leading it, and then Thursday night before Bible study, Evelyn would lead us. Then Michelle would lead us on a Saturday morning, and then I would do it on Sunday, and I've had Nunzi in to do it and Michelle do it. So we really take communion really seriously here at MGF and look on it as a celebration and a way to focus on Jesus.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to do tonight, Sean, was to kind of ask you, our resident historian and resident theologian, or maybe resident nerd.
Resident nerd is a good word.
Person who's willing to put the study in.
Yeah, I enjoy the study.
So you've been doing a little bit of study for us, and I'd like to know kind of how communion developed. You know, I'm sure we'll look at the scriptures later about how it started and Jesus instigated communion, and then Paul reinforces that with the same message. But I'm interested how it kind of moved through history, Sean.
Okay.
I just have this sense that for the majority of church today, communion is really not what it was. And I think a lot of traditions have crept in. So I'd really like you to kind of take us through maybe some history about it, but also where you think these traditions came in.
Yeah, sure.
And I'd like your take on it as well. Coming from your church background, you know, what it used to be for you and things like that.
Sure.
So,
well, the thing is, tonight, because we're doing it in a shorter time span or having this discussion for a shorter time, my explanation will be very brief. It won't be as lengthy as it usually is. And as they used to say in Blue Peter, here's something I prepared earlier. So if we put that on.
You want me to put it on just now, Sean? And maybe explain to everybody just before you start that if you're on our distribution list, you should have got an email at the start of the week with all our communion times. And we're actually having a Zoom meeting. As soon as myself and Sean finish our discussion, I'm going to open up the Zoom room, and you're all very welcome to join us. And then you can have your say, and we'll finish. Sean's going to lead us in communion. So if you need to rush off and get your elements or whatever, that's great. But we're going to have communion right after we've finished.
And if people wanted to get in touch with us so that they can get the link if they haven't got it.
That's right. I should have prepared that, but I've got it on my email, so I can find it and put it up later if anyone needs it.
Yeah.
So I will hand over to you, Sean. I'm going to mute myself while I do that.
Okay, thank you, Vic. So here we go. Now, these are called frescoes, and these were drawn between AD 64 and AD 100, or just after AD 100. So the first 2 frescoes were probably drawn around the time that the Acts of the Apostles was written by Luke. So we're looking at very early interpretations of communion. And what we notice here is we see on the very left that there's a child there. So children were involved in communion, very young child. There are 2 plates. Now, the one on the very right is the bread, but there are two interesting shapes with the one on the left that we will come back to in a moment. And you'll be surprised what that's about. But that's a depiction of how they would have taken communion in the early church, gathered round a table, eating communion as part of a family or part of a fellowship, and sharing that with each other. So if we go to the next one, this is another fresco in Rome. And again, you see the table, you see the people gathered together. But if you look on the very left, you'll notice that the woman holding the chalice, well, it's a woman. It's a woman that's holding the chalice, not a man. So that's very interesting to note, that anybody could lead communion. And whoever was the head of the church or whatever did that. And notice the men are looking to the woman. And this is a depiction of Peter taking communion in Rome. He's the person on the very right. So the thoughts on this alfresco is that it was, on this fresco is that woman on the left was probably his wife leading communion there. So that's Peter on the right and his wife on the left, probably doing communion in the church around AD 64, 65, somewhere like that. So if we go to the next one.
Sorry, can I just butt in, Sean?
Yeah.
I find that fascinating already. And
right.
And you sent me these yesterday and I copied them and put them onto this presentation, but I obviously didn't look at it closely enough.
Right.
And so early on in the church history, we've got a lady leading the service.
Yes, the lady's doing the communion.
And children in there as well.
Children were in there as well. And again, in this fresco, if you look in the middle, just past the big man in the middle, you've got a little child there next to him as well.
Yeah. Thanks for those, Sean. I didn't clock that when you sent them to me. That is fascinating.
Yeah, so it was the whole family were involved in that communion.
But I mean, I think maybe you could keep this slide, and we'll maybe use that for our next talk. We might talk about women leaders in the church. That might be quite an interesting one.
Yeah, that'll be good. I'd love to talk about that.
Anyway, sorry for butting in. So you want the next slide, Sean?
Yes, please. Now, remember those interesting shapes? This fresco was drawn about between 100 and 200 AD. So it's a little bit more clear in detail. And you notice the two shapes in the middle. Well, that's actually fish. And so fish was included as part of the table, not to be eaten, but as part of the table for communion. And again, as we move along, I'll explain why that is. In fact, I'll do that now. Everybody knows that in the early church, Christians had to keep Christianity a secret. And so Christians would draw a fish on the ground as identification to each other to say they were Christian. And if the person drew a fish back or finished the fish off, you knew they were a Christian. If they didn't, then you knew they'd think you were doodling, and that would be that. Anyway, part of the center for the early church was Jesus and the gospel. And Jesus had multiplied the bread and the fish for the feeding of the 5,000. And this was central as a message. Now, the word for fish in Greek is the word ichthus. And ichthus means Jesus Christ, Son of God. Jesus Christus, Theos, Theosotos, which means Jesus Christ, Son of God. And so the acronym was ichthos, which meant fish. But there was more to it than that, because if you met somebody and you drew a fish and you finished the fish and they beckoned you to follow them, that was an invitation to a church communion. You were being invited to communion. So that was important in that element as well. So when you walked into the room, nobody would speak. And this is told by the early church fathers. That's how we know this information. Athanasius and Polycarp talk about this. You'd walk into a room and you'd be in this room and nobody would talk to each other before the communion. But you'd know by a basket full of loaves and 2 fish on the table that you were at a communion supper. so there could be no doubt that that's what you were at. Because in those days, it was common for houses to have wine and bread on the table. So to make sure you were in the right place, the fish was put out and a basket of loaves was also put out. So people knew that you were invited to the communion supper. And they did that in the church during the time of the Romans persecution for about 280 years that occurred. So that was communion then. And if we have the next one, Vic, please. This is, I'm not going to read it all, but this is the first non-biblical account of communion written about 120 AD. And it's one of the church fathers, and for the life of me, I can't remember his name. Hold on a moment. One of the church fathers. Let's see if I got his name. Hold on. Sorry about this, folks. I should have been. It's a document called the Didache, and it was put together by Clement of Alexandria, Eusebius of Caesarea, and Athanasius. And it was done in the end of the beginning of the 3rd century AD. It was when it was completed. It was completed over about 100 years. So it started being put together in 150, and it was finished being put together in 373. But this is the first unbiblical account of what communion is and what it's about. And that was in a document called the Didache. And that's that first account of communion. And it's just the prayer to be said with communion. Vic, if we can have the next one, please. And this is what it would have been like if you walked into that house. Obviously, the fish are under the bread here, but you'd have known by seeing the fish and the bread and the jug that you were in the Christian house and getting ready for communion. So that's that period. And that sort of period lasted up until the 3rd century, when, the 4th century, when the church was established by Constantine. After that, when the church became an official body of Rome and became not just a religious body, but a political body, things changed a little bit. And they started to form a liturgy. And the liturgy was formed between the 4th century and the 10th century. And it very much is what you see today in many churches, be it Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, or even Church of Scotland. They follow that tradition. They have prayers. They follow it with a scripture and a message. Then they have the communion, and then they leave. And that's very much what happened during that time. During all this time and afterwards, up until about the 11th century, the people used their local languages for the communion service. But in the 11th century, for some strange reason, the church just put a stamp on it and said that the only way you could have communion was in Latin. By this time, the Greek Orthodox Church had separated, so they continued it in Greek in the Greek Orthodox Church. But in the Roman Church, which is where we have our roots, even if we're Protestant, we have our roots in that as Christians. We had communion in Latin in the 11th to 12th century, and this continued up until the 20th century. But Latin was the language that was used for the communion service. Then, of course, we all know in the 15th century, the Reformation started. And one of the things that happened in the Catholic Church was that they started having communion wafers, but they took out the wine. And the reason they had communion wafers was that priests on the move could carry them around with them, and people could have communion wherever they were. They couldn't do that with the wine. So the wine was excluded from the Catholic communion service. In Protestantism, there was a lot of problems over communion. Was it the real presence? Was it Jesus working? Was Jesus the real presence? And if so, in what way? And again, Martin Luther put the nail on the head for me with that when he said, well, the real presence isn't the loaf and the wine. The real presence is Christ within each Christian. And I think for me, that explains that term, the real presence, Jesus being in us. So we had the wine and the bread. And so they carried the wafer around with them and wherever they went. Now, that was Catholicism. Protestantism developed their own sort of rite to communion. and as a sort of counter to what Catholics have been doing in their communion. So they could have communion in their own languages. They could have it as a service with the message same as it was in the Catholic Church. But the difference was, because a lot of Protestants felt that the Catholics had abused communion, they made it extra special so they could only have it at select times. And that sort of carried on for a while. When we get to the 20th century, and there's the beauty of it, in the 20th century, Vatican II happened in the Catholic Church, and all that was changed, and the idea of the wine was reintroduced. This was back in the early 1960s, and people having the Mass in their own language, or communion in their own language, was introduced. In the Protestant churches, there was a rethought, particularly by a man called Karl Barth, who spoke a lot in church dogmatics about the fact that communion was now about Christ being alive in the church, and the church was part of that. And so Karl Barth reintroduced, in many ways, having communion on a regular basis within the Protestant churches, and their definition was re-established, that it was about Christ, and to always have that communion service was not a problem. It wasn't a problem to have it 5 times a week, 7 days a week, 1 day a week. It was good to have that communion service. The only problem is, along the way, particularly in the Catholic tradition, was this idea that they take the passage out of 1 Corinthians 10 or 11, which is about examining yourselves, and they see that as being about sin, that you have to examine yourself for sin. And as we know, and what you teach in the church, that's not exactly what that passage is about. But that's a brief history of communion and how it developed.
Awesome, Sean. That was fantastic. I've got loads of questions, but I want to answer one question first. Nunzi has asked about the writing on the wall. So, can you see what that says, Sean? Does it say?
Oh yeah,
Agape?
that's Agape. It's Agape feast. That's what they call communion in the early church. Love feast.
Ah, so it's called the Agape feast.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what the other word for feast was. Oh, Agape, I think Gnosticis, but I don't swear to that. I'm not sure. But
Right.
Agape, it meant love feast. They called them love feasts up until about the end of the 4th century, when the church was established. Communion, or the Eucharist, was called a love feast.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Sean. And fascinating.
Thank you.
Especially about the fish. I loved that explanation about, like, the fish. It was like a code.
Yeah.
You know, I'd heard that before about ichthus and the early Christians writing that on their wall and whatever. But I'd never heard that about having a fish on the table and you walk into the room and you know it's a communion.
Yeah.
So, and that's probably because it was secret and people were having to hide what they were doing.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I heard you right. Did that stop then when the church became institutionalized and came into line with the Roman state?
Yes, it slowly declined. Well, I say slowly. I mean, slowly within a lifetime. So over 60, 70 years, that declined. And because they were no longer hiding, and there was no need to have the fish as a representation, because for them it wasn't.
Okay, so it's not something that, you know, because people often say, oh, I want to be like an Acts church and I want to be like the early church. So it's not like I have to get a couple of trout on the table for the next time we'll have communion.
No, in fact, one of the things Carol put to me today was, did they eat the fish or what happened to them? They probably had a meal with the fish afterwards, I should imagine, but they weren't used in the communion at all.
Well, Nunzi's a couple of comments have come up. So Nunzi said, can we have fish on our communion table and can we start calling it the love feast? Yeah. And Karl is saying there is no chance of our church not talking at the start of the services. Yeah, I quite like that. You know, when you come to church on Sunday, you just come in quietly and sit down. That would be novel, wouldn't it, Sean?
It would, but the difference being for them, they were living in a time where Christianity meant you were either put into the gladiatorial sports or you were eaten by a lion. So people were scared, and it wasn't unusual for the Romans to try to trap people. So you'd walk in and you'd stay very quiet, not wanting to give the Romans any ammunition. And I think then once the communion started, you could take a sigh of relief that it was what you come for. But I think that's why they didn't talk to each other, because they didn't want to each other.
And I'm not sure if you've said that. Evelyn's asking, did they eat the fish with the bread after communion? I'm assuming they would.
Maybe, we just don't know. Possibly. I should imagine fish sandwiches for everybody, possibly.
Yeah, well, you know, back in the day when we were allowed to, we used to stay after the service and have our lunch, didn't we?
Yeah.
So it might be that, you know, somebody would have eaten that.
Yeah.
So absolutely fascinating. I took a note, Sean. It took 16 minutes and 43 seconds for you to say the S word.
Which was?
Sin.
All right.
Now, I've been in and around church circles now for too many years to mention. And everywhere I've been, apart from when I listened to some of the grace preachers like the Andrew Womacks, the Joseph Princes of this world, and when I started moving and teaching that way, I've always heard communion being associated with sin. No, not that it was sinful as it were, but that it was a place to examine yourself for sin. Now, you mentioned that. Now, we really don't believe that. We believe it's a place for giving thanks to God the Father and a place for remembering what Jesus Christ has done for us. So how did this, and the way you were talking about it being Christ-centered and Christ-focused at the start, why did it become associated with examining yourself for sin? Was it purely that scripture in 1 Corinthians 11?
I'm afraid it was, and it was again our friend Augustine that put his initials on that with some others, and they assumed that was talking about sin, examining yourself for sin, because nowhere else in the Gospels do we get it saying anything of that nature. Jesus didn't say at the beginning of communion, "Okay, lads, can we confess our sins? Then we can start." There was none of that. And what he set up in communion in the Gospels is exactly what he set up for the church. No different from what we have today.
Yeah. So I've just looked at that verse, Sean. And it does say, let a man examine himself. But it just says, let a man examine himself.
Yeah.
Where does the sin come into that? Because that's not mentioned in this passage.
No, it's the word examined. There's a presumption with that word examined, because in the modern parlance or in Latin, to examine yourself meant to check yourself for any faults or for any sins.
Okay.
So that sort of the assumption was made. Oh, that's why that word is there, and that's why that.
Yeah. So I mean, we know that there are different translations and different versions and whatever. And I'm looking at the King James, and it doesn't say sin. I was just wondering if it was there in the original Greek. If it was, are there any translations that put the sin word in there that you know of?
No, not even the ones that have set it up. I don't want to pick on traditions tonight, but
okay.
No matter what ones have set it up, all their translations have it exactly as it's written in the as best as they can in the Greek, and there's no reference to sin in any of those scriptures at all.
Aye, and I liked when you spoke about moving from the Catholic tradition into the Protestant tradition, and how the Protestant tradition tried to make communion special.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they had it less.
Yeah.
So there are some churches, aren't there, that have it once every 6 months or whatever.
Yeah.
And that is.
Yeah, and I can respect that because of their hearts of doing it. It's the fact that they want to do it properly for Jesus, sort of thing, and I sort of respect that. I don't put a downer on it, but yeah, they do it every so often, maybe 4 times a year, or even just twice a year.
Yeah, I had a really good friend I used to work for. I still have got a good friend I used to work with. And he was an elder in the Free Church of Scotland, and I think they had it once every 6 months. And he found it really quite strange that we would have communion every Sunday, and when we had a Bible study, and if we had a meeting at home, he just couldn't. Probably took away the specialness for him.
Yeah.
But there's nothing in Scripture, Sean. Are we okay taking communion every time we meet?
I mean, Paul was talking to the Corinthians, and all of us, I think most of us in Murray Grace know the story of the Corinthians. They were a church that had major upheaval. There was lots of separation, lots of division, and they were constantly arguing about this, that, and the other, on top of which they would come to communion, and the rich people would bring their lavish meals and eat them in front of the poor people who had nothing. So, and then when it came to communion, it was just abused. And Paul's basically saying in that passage in Corinthians, he's saying, make sure your church has no division when you have communion. Not about the sin, but it was the fact that you're not working as a unity with Christ and being part of that body. And that's what Paul is getting at there in the Corinthian scriptures. He's not talking about sin. He's talking about a church unified in one mind, in love, looking to Jesus and remembering what Jesus has done for them. So, in fact, the examination is about examining yourself to make sure you've got the right thing on your mind, which is Jesus, and remembering what he did for us. That's what the examination is about.
Okay, Sean, I've got an interesting comment and from someone called Facebook user. So sometimes the user's name doesn't come through from Facebook.
That's fine.
But they're saying, I was also taught to offer up a prayer of confession first, but examining yourself could mean making peace with anyone you have had an argument with.
Sort of, if it was separating you from taking part in the communion, then maybe you needed to do that for a psychological reason, and maybe we all have to do that at times. But it wasn't a scriptural prerogative in that sense for that time.
And I think it would also be important to discuss or ask, what your understanding of confession means. Because maybe that's another conversation we'll have at a later date, Sean, because we do know there's a difference between the Hebrew meaning of confession under the Old Covenant and that Greek word confession under the New Covenant. They're completely different things.
Yeah.
And we've got another question from Karl. Good questions coming in, guys. This is great. How does communion work with healing? And a little bit sarcastic here, Karl. If we can only have it twice a year, does that mean we can only get sick then?
Yeah, it works with healing because communion is a representation of salvation, and as we know, salvation is sozo. So therefore, when you look to Jesus and you look to Jesus Christ and salvation, you're looking to healing. We know there's 5. Salvation means 5 things, not just dealing with death and sin. So healing was part of that. And Paul does say in Corinthians as well about, or somewhere else maybe, that people were dying because they weren't having communion properly. And what he means by that, he doesn't just mean dying in the flesh, as in dying, but he means dying in their ignorance. People were ignorant of the truth of communion because it was being abused. So Paul's talking on 2 levels there. He's talking regarding the people actually dying in reality, but they're dying in ignorance because communion isn't being used properly for them. And I think there are records in the early church of people actually being healed during communion as well.
Well, I imagine it's, what we teach communion is for is a time of giving thanks to God the Father and a time to remember what Jesus has done. And I would, I'm a great believer in as a man thinketh, so is he, and death and life are in the power of the tongue. So if we are thinking about Jesus and his finished work, and we are thinking about healing, and we're speaking that out, there's a chance that you're going to manifest that healing that you've already got on the inside.
Exactly.
So that's good.
And imagine that happening at a fellowship or a church or in a house. How much more it gives you the emotion to accompany that praise, to thank God for what he's done for you. You know, it helps that. It moves it along.
Yeah. Right. Awesome. Nunzi's put on a little comment, a little story about, she remembers once that the pastor saying that if you have anything against anyone, go to them before communion and make peace with them. And one poor lady had 6 people go up to her. That's not probably great man management, isn't it?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know quite a few stories like that.
Yeah. And thanks, Jane. Thank Jane Vernon, put her name on there. Thanks for joining us and saying that it was you that had the comment about the prayer of confession and examining yourself. So that's really good. Thank you for that, Jane. Nice to have you with us. I've also just posted in the comment section, if anyone else can see it, I've posted up there our link for the communion on Zoom once we've finished. Because it's good that you can put your comments on here, but we can't get full interaction until we go on to Zoom.
And folks, it's just right to say, don't if you do hold views like that, don't feel guilty about it. I myself came up in a tradition. Again, I'm not going to name the tradition. People who know me know it. That was very much into confessing sins and before you had communion and all that. So I've been through that, and I lived that way for about 25 years of my life. So I know that it's very hard to let go of that way of thinking if you have problems, but you can, and you do, with the right teachers and the right teaching and reading the word and finding out.
Amen. Well, I'd like to, add to that, Sean. I don't think we're having a go at people for doing that.
No.
Kind of pointing out, but what we believe, we're not trying to pick on people's traditions, but what we believe is about communion is scriptural. And I'd love to have a discussion with you about that if you're out there. But do remember, if you have a discussion with me, my favourite question is, what verse is that from?
Yep.
Give me chapter and verse. So, and hopefully I'll be able to give you a view of what my hope is. Eveline saying, yes, she can remember taking communion and not understanding why she had to confess her sins. So, yes, made you focus on sin rather than the love of Jesus. That's right, Eveline. I mean, what we believe here is that communion is a time for focusing on Jesus and not focusing on yourself.
Amen.
And it's a time to focus on what he's done, who he is, who he always will be, focus on the great exchange that took place on the cross, focus on what we have in our spirit because of that, and then what we can manifest. So, yes, that's what communion is for us, and that's why we do it. We do it every time. Really glad we don't have to do it in Latin anymore, Sean.
Me too.
So you do a bit of Hebrew and Greek. You're not into Latin at all, are you?
A little bit, not overly so. I mean, I learned a lot about the English language by studying Latin, because that's how I learned about tenses and the various forms of tenses and various things. But no, I know the odd word and I can put the odd phrase together. But honestly, Latin is something that I'm not very good. Well, I'm not very good at Greek and Hebrew either, but I work harder at those than I do at Latin.
Yeah. No, that's good. Getting a few more comments coming in. Karl saying it's important we need to look in the Bible rather than go to tradition or check if our tradition is in the Bible.
Yeah.
And Nunzi's saying, if we're supposed to confess our sin, why do that halfway through the service and communion? We should have done that at the start to get it out of the way.
I used to think that.
Did you, Sean? Yeah.
Yeah, I used to think, why aren't we doing it now rather than later? Yeah.
Yeah, and then you kind of get that out of the way, and all right. No, that's great. Right, I don't know why Nunzi's written. Oh, it's a bit of Latin. I think that's a joke from Morse that Nunzi's just put.
Right. Well, as long as
Yeah.
she's not expecting me to translate it, we're okay.
No, it was a funny quote, Latin quote out of Inspector Morse, and I can't remember what it was supposed to mean. But when you say it, it is "when toes are weary, west a bit."
Right.
So, but Morse thought it was funny. So, have you got anything else to add, Sean? Any more nuggets for us?
Well, I think the problem we have with communion today is there are so many traditions that do it, and it's good we're doing it. I mean, one of the great blessings about this, if you think about it, is that there's not been at any hour on this earth somebody's having communion, and for the last 2,000 years, every day, and possibly every hour, people have been having communion. So communion is an ongoing feast that's had everywhere at every time and every when. So that's the blessing. Now, of course, there's all the theologies behind it, and again, we believe that the theologies are part of that tradition and culture, and they've got it wrong, maybe, or whatever. But the fact that people have had communion, they've sat down, they've had the bread and they've had the wine, they've shared that in whatever form, I think is quite remarkable. 2,000 years of that.
I think that's a really good point, Sean. And if it's done properly, when it's done properly, a time to just take time out of your day or time out of your service, even time out of your Sunday service, just to take that small time to focus on Jesus and nothing else. That can't be bad.
No.
Now, I've said this in the past. About people taking communion in their home. I mean, if I was away for extended periods when I was working away from home more, I used to take communion myself in my hotel room. And it was a good excuse for ordering cheese and biscuits and wine, on room service. But there's nothing to stop people doing it themselves, Sean.
No, not at all. And using anything they want. I mean, there's a remarkable story. I think Andrew Wellmack tells this story. I know somebody does, about a lorry driver who suddenly felt the need to have communion, and all he had on him was a can of Coke and a Yorkie bar or something, and he took that as communion. And I'm not making it law that everybody's got to go out and buy a Yorkie bar and a can of Coke, but you can take communion in whatever way that you can. But if you've got the bread and you've got the wine, or the juice, in our case, I'll use juice. That's fine. Just use what's there, and Jesus will bless it because it's from the heart.
Yeah, and I'm just looking at my computer screen here. I'm going to share this one again, Sean, because I love this picture. That to me looks like a family scene in a home.
Yeah, very much.
And
so.
I mean, I love it now that we can see it's the Agape feast. There's a couple of bairns there, but I love it that a woman is leading that service or that part of the service.
Yeah, and the fact that she was probably Peter's wife is even more significant, because there's Peter and he's honouring the wine or the wine that his wife's holding. So he's not got his hands up in horror or whatever, but he's there sitting in reverence to that communion service.
And that reminds me of a meeting we were in last night. I think a few of you guys may have been there as well.
Yeah.
We had a Zoom meeting with Jews for Jesus last night, and they were taking us through a Passover meal that Jewish families would do. And what I loved about that was seeing the Morgan family, I think they were called, and the wife was playing a very active role in that service. As was the young man, Dylan, the son. The whole family was involved in that Passover meal, which is like where Jesus instigated that first ever communion.
Yeah.
And that was lovely to see the whole family involved in that. And that picture, Sean, that's really just made my night. because I'm a especially a strong preacher about women leaders in the church, and I really so thanks for sharing that. That's blessed me. So that's really good. Awesome. Any other nuggets? Anybody got any more questions? We've had Carol saying the wife always starts the Passover meal throughout history. Excellent. That's good. So So we need to keep making sure we have ladies leading us in our communion. And when we've been doing it through the week, it's been half and half, Sean, you and me, and Eveline and Michelle. So that's great.
And then Nunzi sometimes as well.
Absolutely. So
that's
quite often.
That's the beautiful thing about our fellowship is that we have a woman pastor. Not just you, Vic, but your wife as well, Nunzi.
Amen.
She's pastor of our church, and she is respected as a pastor, and she has taught some cracking stuff. If people again want to check the resources, not that you don't teach cracking stuff, but just to say, as a woman, she has taught some remarkable stuff.
You got yourself well out of that hole there, Sean. Well done.
I thought I was doing a carol there.
Stop digging. Yeah. So that's great. So I think what we should do, I mean, we thought it was going to last about half an hour, but that's us up to 45 minutes already. So what I think we'll do, Sean, is finish our broadcast. And I sent out the link earlier this week, but the link is also now in the comments box. If someone doesn't have the link, you send me an email or something. Michelle, no worries that you can't stay for communion. I'll see you tomorrow morning. Thanks for being with us. So, yes, let's finish this broadcast, and then I will go and open up the Zoom meeting for everyone that you can come into that. Sean, you said you'd be about 5 minutes. Did you say?
Just about 5 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll just open up the Zoom and let people in as they arrive. So, thank you very much for being with us, folks. Thanks for all the comments and the questions. Sean, thanks for doing the research again. I just come on here and ask the questions, so that's great. Thanks for your pictures. I'm going to keep that one, the Agape one. I think I'm going to put that as my background or something. I love that. So thanks for doing all the work, Sean. Really appreciate that. I'm going to do I know Sean won't, but I'm going to do a little bit of a plug. I got my book in today, nice and early. So Sean has written a sort of, what would you say, a novelization?
Novelization of Mark's Gospel.
Novelization of Mark's Gospel. So I read the first couple of chapters, really good, so I can recommend that. And then once I publish my book, Sean, you can hold that up and do that as well.
We will. Look forward to it.
You pat my back and I'll pat yours, kind of thing.
Exactly.
Okay, so thanks for joining us, folks. Yes, thank you for that Facebook user that said, awesome, Sean. Great bit of research again and good knowledge, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
So thanks for joining us, folks. I will see you over in Zoom in a couple of moments. Just give me a chance to shut things down, open up Zoom, and I'll see you all there soon. So I'll see you in a couple of minutes, Sean.
Okay, see you later. I'm just going
God bless everyone. See you soon. Bye.
See you later. Bye.